Hey there, everybody. This is Glenn Loury. Yes, rumors of my demise are premature. I am back from back surgery. One doctor told me that the procedure that I underwent, which involved extensive spinal reconstruction, was the nuclear option. I've been struggling with lower back pain, arthritis for decades, and I finally bit the bullet and have had something done about it. So I'm a wreck, but I'm still going strong, and we want to get back to the Glenn Show. The episode that you're about to see is a montage of content at the Glenn Show bearing on the death and aftermath of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But first, I want you to know that John McWhorter and I are going to be in conversation next week. And I will be interviewing guests talking about all manner of things, including turmoil on American campuses and renegotiations of our understandings about freedom of expression in shows going forward. I'm not going to do too much. I'm going to do just enough to keep things going over here. In this episode, the episode for this week, you're going to hear from me and John McWhorter, of course. Also the philosopher Joshua Collin, Jordan Peterson, Ian Rowe, who's a charter school entrepreneur, and documentarians Liz Collins and Chaix, as well as the Attorney General of the good state of Minnesota, the Honorable Keith Ellison. That's what's in store for you. I'm on the mend. Thanks for tuning in to The Glenn Show. We should indeed introduce the topic du jour, which is racial conflict in America. The case in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery shot dead by the McMichael family, the father and the son, in an encounter. I'm not even going to try to summarize it. Called a lynching by many and occasioning a brouhaha. And now in Minneapolis, the killing of George Floyd is his name, a Houston native. It turns out, John, that my wife LaJuan's brother is a friend of, because the kid grew up in Houston in the third ward in Houston. He actually knows, Pierre actually knows, knew George Floyd.
Really?
And was bereft at the learning of his death, but dying with the police officer's knee pressing his head into the ground and choking him off at the trachea. He can't breathe. He's saying he can't breathe. He's not resisting in any way, shape, or form, and now he's killed. And the aftermath of that, John, which is rioting in the streets of Minneapolis, the precinct across the street from the precinct where these police officers reported as a target, which was being looted. I'm reading in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, people are walking out with big screen TVs from the Target. Shopkeepers, mostly immigrants up and down the avenue in the vicinity, are having to stand guard or to watch their places being set ablaze by rioting in the streets. These are Black people. This is about race in America. This is our beat. Our beat is about race. Race is blowing up in our face right now. And the question is, what do we have to say about it? I'm so glad I'm talking to you.
Me too, Glenn, because this is some stuff. And I've really been thinking about it because you have to allow that you might be wrong. And I don't mean to sound all high and mighty, but if you really are trying to get to the truth, you have to be able to take a deep breath and think, have I got this wrong? Like, is all of this disproving everything I've always thought? I don't think the other side ever do that. And that is high and mighty to say. I say that highly and mightily, and I try not to be them.
So you're starting to think that you may have been wrong?
Oh, hell no. But I consider it because I'm thinking, this guy gets killed. He's running down the street and he ends up getting killed. And then here's this person, the knee is on his neck and he dies. And you see this other cop, Asian for the record, but the other cop standing there just watching this, which I find extremely curious. Why didn't one of them say, come on? This is my question, Glenn, about both of those things. And this is the sort of thing Coleman Hughes would ask. And he's right. And it seems too clinical to many people, but is the reason that Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd died because they're black? And there's a certain kind of person who says, oh, well, eyes rolling. But no. The question is, and here's where, they're responsible for really doing some mental work and trying to turn things around. If a white guy had been seen on camera, if I've got the facts right, kind of poking around a construction site over and over again, would the owner of that site not have told those brothers to go check out what looked like that white person jogging down the street? Can we know? Because then if the white person tried to grab the gun, do we know that couldn't have happened if the person was white? And even with George Floyd, what a tragedy. We look at it and we say, they did it because he's black. How do we know they wouldn't have done that to Nils Olson? I'm trying to create some white Minnesotan. And he's kind of a miscreant. I mean, George Floyd was a forger, they say. But let's say that it's Nils Olson, and he keeps on trying to resist. Would those cops not have done exactly what they did because they would have more sympathy for Nils? I don't know how we know that. What do you think?
Okay. I think most people's eyes are going to roll back in their head when they hear you say that and say, of course, it's because of race. Well, you mean this is America? And then they're going to tout off all the names, remember the names, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, etc. Of course, this is America. The cops are racist. It was a long legacy, white supremacy. Haven't you heard of it? So at some level, I'm not sure there's anything constructive to be had in litigating the question that you put, although as a theoretical or kind of exercise, an abstract exercise, I think it's not, I'm a social scientist, right? So we deal in causality, right? So what does the evidence show, right? So can you prove, this kind of thing that Roland Fryer, people like that with the statistics, and they try to go into. At that level, no, we don't know that it was because of race. And the thing about it is that the hypothetical counterfactual, if he had been white, is never going to be actually observed. There's no way you can experimentally construct that. So there's a very deep limitation as a matter of statistically rational inference about what you can quote unquote know about such things. But you know how Bill Maher has this thing. I don't know for a fact that it's true, but I just know it's true. I can't prove it for a fact, but Bill Maher has a little routine that he does sometimes on the show. And then he goes with the comedy and, he'll have 6 or 8 different, little ditties where, he knows it's true. He knows, for example, that Lindsey Graham's gay. This is the kind of thing that it's a little bit like that. I can't prove it for a statistical fact, but I know it's true that if, and you can't argue with that. That's part of your religion. There's no adjudicating that. That's what they're always going to think. So at some level, I don't find that to be that. But there obviously is something wrong in police culture when you see behavior like that, regardless of the color of the guy. So we can start with that. There's something wrong with police culture because when the police officer who's standing by doesn't intervene in the thing that you and I all saw, and doesn't do anything, well, that's telling me something very deep about the way they're doing business on a daily basis in that city. And that's obviously an issue. Now, is that a racial issue? Well, again, in terms of causality, probably. Historically, it probably has something to do with dealing with crime and miscreants and danger and, policing in the particular city of Minneapolis. And I don't know the history there, but I'm sure there is one. This is the Philando Castile territory and whatnot. So, and there are many incidents. If I knew more, I could tick them off. So probably there is some thing there that is very interesting as a matter of social history that contributes to the culture of policing that is colored or affected by race. That's one kind of thing you could say. But the other thing, and I don't want to, I want to give you a chance. The other thing is how it gets narrated, how it gets constructed. Race might have been a part of it, but it might have been 5% of it. But now it has become the entire thing. It's become a statement about the nature of race in America. And that's I think, a highly questionable, a very problematic move.
We don't acknowledge progress. And who wants to talk about progress when somebody, has just had their life snuffed out? But the facts here seem so plain that sometimes I find myself thinking, should I just shut up? Because sometimes the facts aren't important. Sometimes sitting here and what really needs to happen. And there's a question for you. What needs to happen is that the cops need to be reformed. And that would have so many benefits on so many levels. The cops need to be blown up and started again. Now, here you and I are saying, well, technically they kill, many more white people. And if there's a disproportion, it's because of socioeconomics. So, Floyd did not die because he was black, technically. Maybe nobody wants to hear that, and maybe they don't need to hear it at this point. Maybe it's too picky a point. If the cops do harass black people more, maybe the point that they don't murder black people more isn't valuable in this particular setting. Sometimes I think, am I being a tattletale in the fifth grade or something? What do you think about that? That this isn't the time for the points that we're trying to make?
I think this is the time that we must make the points that we're trying to make. And now I will include myself in that first person plural, because I actually don't disagree with you at all in what you've been saying, but I see what the other arguments would be. I think we have to, because we're in the grip of hysteria. When staff at the New York Times say that the editor Bennett decision there, the editorial page, op-ed page editor, to publish Tom Cotton's essay calling for federal troops to keep the peace in American cities if necessary. Some of the staff there, the African Americans, I gather, I'm just talking about what I read in the newspaper, said that they were put physically in danger by the piece that their editor decided to run in their newspaper, because I suppose they're black and they might be covering or participating in demonstrations, and then the federal troops might somehow fire on them and then they might be hurt. How absurd is that? How absurd is that? Running an editorial puts somebody in danger because it advocated a position that you disagree with, a position that I don't agree with myself. But goodness, you've got people saying that they're afraid to go. I'm talking about people like you and me. Okay, make the same income, live in the same neighborhoods, wear the same clothes, have the same occupations. Talking about they feel physically threatened to be in the presence of a police officer. That's hysteria. It's hysterical. Okay, it's like saying I won't leave my house because I'm going to be struck by lightning. Okay, the idea that that incident with Mr. Floyd somehow is emblematic of the experience of African American is ridiculous. It's completely disconnected from reality. Okay. No one wants to say this. How do you end up in a conflict with the cops? How did that happen? How does that happen? You actually have to do something. I'm not blaming Mr. Floyd. Please don't get mad at me. I'm just making an obvious point that the cops don't just drag you out of your vehicle and start choking you, man. Okay. Now, what's my point? My point is simply this. What happened to him is unlikely to happen to you unless you end up in a similar disputation with the cops. Now, again, I'm not saying don't live or else the cops will kill you. All I'm saying is, in estimating the quantitative magnitude of the risk to your life, consider that it is circumstantial, that it depends upon actual circumstances in which one finds oneself. So I don't know. I mean, I think we have to speak out because of hysteria. And I think we also have to speak out because the stakes here are absolutely huge. What do you think about defund the police? That's the new slogan now, defund the police. What do you think about basically turning a blind eye to violence and saying ridiculous things like the loss of Mr. Floyd's life, as tragic and outrageous as it was, somehow justifies or causes us to look askance at absolutely despicable behavior, burning down the small business of the poor fellow who's tried to scratch out a living around the corner. Come on, there's no excuse for firing on police officers, for throwing projectiles at them. So I don't know. There's a sense I feel in which it's a responsibility to try to speak out against these things. And this the huge thing here is whether or not the loss of Mr. Floyd's life was is properly taken as being indicative of white supremacist domination of black bodies. It amazes me that we even speak such sentences.
You know, this is a rare time when I am not going to do my thing of suggesting to you that your disgust is not empathetic enough, because I'm angry this time too for some of the same reasons you are. And I have had to restrain myself from really thinking in my head that the people in question are not well. And I always have to remind myself, if it's that many people who are doing this, you can't call it insane. And I really don't like calling people crazy, but unfortunately there are people who are truly disgusting me. And that is, professional Black people living lives that almost anybody on earth would envy, who are walking around pretending that they actually feel physically threatened by the police when they walk down the street, when they're just minding their business, who are pretending that what happened to George Floyd and what it supposedly symbolizes is making them so upset, that they're so traumatized by this that they can't be expected to do the work that they would normally do.
And that's the public health. That's one part of the trouble, the very worrisome character of the current situation. The second part is that there's a social crisis crystallized in this publicly observed lynching in Minneapolis. I mean, it was.
Why do you call it a lynching? Seriously, it's a serious question. It was a horrible police brutality killing of a man. That's true. Why are we calling it a lynching? Because the man was Black? Why would it be any less egregious an offense against our sensibilities and our moral commitments if the victim of that had been white? How do you know? And I'm really kind of playing devil's advocate here, but it's a serious question. How do you know that the motivations of the rogue police officer who took that man's life were racial?
I don't know. I'm not talking about his motivations. I'm talking about, a pattern of violence. And I call it a lynching really partly because he didn't put a rope around his neck, but he put a knee on his neck and kept it there until he was dead.
It was horrible. There's no doubt that it was horrible. But the word lynching, and I'm asking this for a serious reason, the word lynching evokes a very long political history, and I want to know the connection of this event to that history.
Well, look at Philando Castile was also in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis police don't have a great track record of protecting Black citizens. Minneapolis has, and to widen the scope here, Minneapolis, if you look at economic inequality, wealth and income inequality in Minneapolis, it's bad even by national standards. It's about 2.5x on income and wealth in Minneapolis. And, it's partly because, I don't know what was on his mind or in his heart. I know what was on his face, and there was a look of, he's a smug prick. And he had his hand in his pocket.
I saw it, man. I saw it.
I know you saw it. And
as like he was kneeling to pray or bored in church or something like that. I mean, it was horrible.
That's right. And so when I saw it, part of so it's partly, I'm thinking of this as it's on his neck. Partly it's the pattern of racial enforcement and violence. Partly it's the smug look on his face and the hand in his pocket. Partly it's the conspicuous display of this. as if, and I don't know what was on his mind or on his heart, but a conspicuous display of it, as if part of the point of this was to say to people, you see what I'm doing?
See, I can do this.
Yeah.
It's
about it's the reinforcement of, to speak in kind of functionalist terms here, it's about the reinforcement of this racial hierarchy, racial subordination.
But it happens to white people too, Josh. You know that. This event, I mean, in fact, someone sent me a link to this something in Dallas. I can't remember the guy's name. It's a white guy that basically had his life taken in some horrible police encounter when he wouldn't do exactly what they told him to do when they tried to restrain him, and the guy was crying out for his life and he dies. I wish I could send you the. But the point is, and then there was a press conference sometime afterwards, and his mother is depicted there, and she's weeping and talking about how they brutally killed her son. He was a white guy. That event did not occasion the national uproar that this one has done. And I'm not trying to be picky here. I'm really trying to say something, because the police are off the chain here in this country, in many municipalities. That's a first order issue, but it doesn't have to be a racial issue unless we make it so. And so I'm trying to, kind of interrogate that a little bit.
Well, I share your pessimism. I've said it here many times. I think the only thing we can do is tell the truth as best we understand it. I mean, we are not in positions of power or influence in terms of control of the major organs or of the political agenda. And, I think you have to hope that the cumulative effect of a lot of different testimonies that are as respectful of the truth as people understand it can win out in the end. But I'm very pessimistic about it. And you say you think that Chauvin might well be acquitted. I don't know. I haven't followed the trial super closely. I do read the news reports. I gather the closing arguments are being offered perhaps even as we speak. The jury will deliberate as long as it deliberates, and then a verdict will come out. My guess would be that they'll find a way of convicting him of something. But
it won't be considered enough.
The question will be, will it be considered to be enough? Cooler heads should prevail. People should be told not to riot and loot. If the summer of 2020 is any guide, I certainly don't count on that message coming from the major organs of cultural influence, who will report about mostly peaceful protests and will basically join the bandwagon of university presidents, newspaper editors, and CNN commentators to the effect that, I saw Van Jones on Chris Cuomo's program the other night saying, it'll be open season on black people if Derek Chauvin doesn't go down in this trial. And I thought, how profoundly irresponsible of you to say that. My gosh, just to flip the script on that for a minute. Imagine black defendants sitting in a courthouse somewhere who've committed some heinous crime. They happen. Suppose the victims are white. Suppose you had a Rush Limbaugh type out there broadcasting, if they don't get 50 years, we ought to burn this motherfucker down. These black criminals, blah, 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 blah. We're not so far from that, man. You think the typical working class white American who might or might not have voted for Donald Trump is buying this bullshit that the Maxine Waters of the world are spewing? They are not. They are biding their time, biting their tongues, and keeping their powder dry. But they know it's a fraud. They know that if you want to go from suburban in the inner city St. Louis, you'd better do it while the sun is still in the sky. They know who the threats to them are on the streets of American cities. They know that the cops, by and large, are doing an impossible job as best that they can. Some of them are their friends. Some of them are their relatives. You think that they're buying this woke racial line? The resentments continue to smolder. There are a million Jody Shaws. This is the employee at Smith College who has become a small cultural phenomenon for speaking out against wokeness as it has been visited upon her. How many people sit through these diversity training things and come out of there smoldering with anger, which they won't express? How many parents are pulling their children from high-end private schools like the one that Barry Weiss featured in her Substack column recently, saying that the school has lost its way as it has drunk this Kool-Aid and then wants to inflict it upon our children. Now, that guy's probably a liberal New York hedge fund manager or something like that. What do you think a gas station attendant in a small town in upstate New York is thinking? Chickens will come home to roost here. People are playing with fire when they racialize the crime discussion in this country because of the vast overrepresentation of African Americans amongst the violent criminals inflicting mayhem upon their fellows. That's just a fact. You can hide from it all you want to. You can excuse it. The arguments people are making are ridiculous. So if I say black on black crime, 8,000 black people murdered, they say, well, all murder is within race. And they ignore the fact that blacks are 10% of the population and half of the homicide victims. Of course, all murders are within race. You don't kill people that you don't know, by and large. You kill people that you know, that you have conflicts with, by and large. So they are interracial, but it's irrelevant. That was not a refutation of my observation that 8,000 people are being killed. And then they're smug and they cross their arms across their chest and they think they got you. These are stupid arguments. And the stupidity of them, the venality of them, the banality of them will not go unnoticed by a great many Americans. Chickens will come home to roost. You think Donald Trump is the end of it? You think that by calling him and his voters racist, you have vanquished this concern, backlash that I'm talking about from the political scene? You have not. You're not winning. Chickens will come home to roost here. You racialize a crime discussion in America when blacks are so vastly overrepresented amongst the criminals? Why would you do that? You think you can talk only about white cops and not about black criminals? You can't. You can on the editorial pages in the New York Times. That's true. They'll tell you that looting is as American as apple pie. But in the real America, these people are not fools. They can see what's going on. So we just have to keep doing what we're doing, in my opinion, and hope for the best.
I'm not quite with this attempt to make him a hero. Like, what happened to him was a horrible thing. But this idea that you take him from boyhood up to that night and make it seem like some sort of parable of the black man trying his best and he's almost some sort of role model, and there must be somebody who's writing an opera about him right now. I don't quite get that. I don't think he was a monster, but there's something a little weird about that trope as well.
Well, part of the whole victimhood narrative is that it rests upon this idea that is particularly for black people, we're cleansed, right? We're cleansed of any kind of violence or proactive action that would justify this kind of behavior that in certain instances comes our way. And I feel we have to fight that, It doesn't mean that there aren't instances, particularly of police brutality, that should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
Like that.
But when we get to the point where you can't even ask the question of what were the conditions that led to these incidents, we are robbing our own people of agency. Right? We're robbing our own selves of the responsibility of our own behavior.
I agree, but I can hear the counter argument. You want to talk about conditions. Okay, well, maybe George Floyd was passing a counterfeit $20 bill and maybe he was resisting arrest. But the deeper conditions, the conditions of poverty, structural racism, et cetera. I mean, George Floyd had an education or didn't have one. George Floyd had a job or he didn't have one. He came from a community where there were investments being made or were not being made.
Yep.
He was confronted by a system of which Derek Chauvin, the police officer, is merely an agent or representative, but the structures of power that suppress people like George Floyd run far beyond that, and that the lionization of the individual George Floyd is not a celebration of his way of life. It's rather seizing upon a symbol which is at hand, his murder by Derek Chauvin, to amplify our protest and discontent with the larger structural issues, so that when you fixate, he didn't have his shoelaces tied right. He walked with a limp. he didn't speak politely to the police officer, you trivialize the deep issues of justice and power that are at play in an incident like George Floyd.
Yeah, well,
that would be the counter argument.
No, I think it's a solid counter argument because there is wisdom in that. I mean, that is that's the complexity and nuance that in some ways I do try to address in my book, Agency, because I do see these two meta-narratives that I think apply here, right? The kind of what I call the blame the system versus the blame the victim narrative, right? In the blame the system narrative, that's what you hear most of, particularly from the progressive left, which basically says, it's the systems, it's the lack, America itself is this oppressive nation that based on your race or your gender or some other immutable characteristic, that is the blame the system to the core argument. There's a white supremacist lurking on every corner. Capitalism itself is evil. And these systems are so rigged, so discriminatory, so powerful that you, and let's put on race, you as a young Black person have no shot in this system, right? In addition, though, there is this other narrative that I am very empathetic to, which is part of the reason I run schools, which is the blame the victim narrative. Right? And that narrative says, you're responsible. You're responsible for your own failure. You didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? You didn't take advantage of all the opportunities that America has laid out in front of you. We have to acknowledge that there are kids growing up in that kind of situation that you just described. George Floyd. That doesn't mean that George Floyd isn't still ultimately responsible for the actions that he took on that day. But we do have to be cognizant of the conditions that we all should be working towards.
George Floyd, I don't remember the conditions. I'm making this up. I'm making him an archetype. George Floyd has a sister. I'm just guessing. And George Floyd's sister works as a school teacher, or George Floyd's sister works as a security guard, or George Floyd's sister is some sort of entrepreneur. George went a different way. We see that with this kind of Black family all the time. What is it that George Floyd's sister, in quotation marks, did that he didn't? My thought is always that part of it is what the Black community has been taught to see as a norm, not as ideal, but as a norm. I think there's a lack of a basic recoil towards a certain direction that there used to be more of. Nobody was perfect in 1950, but there was more of a recoil among more people towards going in a certain direction, and things changed in the late 60s. What is it that his sister did that he didn't, and how can we teach more people to do what his sister did? Or he has a brother who's a security guard and is doing just fine, or he's a plumber, but George kind of went the wrong way. What happened?
I mean, it's a hypothetical, but if we are to hypothesize, both the sister and the brother you both described as being employed, so that is a fundamental that they're working. And so inherent in that is a certain level of dignity and discipline that comes along with having to show up for a job on time. It's likely that, again, this is hypothetical, but I would imagine that if they did not have a child outside of marriage, that would have put them in a dramatically different situation than I think George Floyd, who I do believe had children outside of marriage. And again, that single fact doesn't necessarily condemn someone to a life of horror. We know there are many stories of kids being born into single-parent homes who become successful, while there are people born to married two-parent households who are not successful. But the data is overwhelming if you look at the profile. And when you talk about norms, in the Black family, as you guys talk about all the time, you talk about 1950, that's when the marriage rates amongst the Black community were, I believe, even higher than that of the white community. They were on a decline at that point, unfortunately, because of new norms, and some argue welfare policies starting in the 60s, that actually started to create perverse incentives around things like marriage and the responsibility of work and finishing your education. All these things matter.
After George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin, the police officer in Minneapolis, and there were protests that broke out in cities around the world, and especially cities around the United States, and some of those protests turned violent. And there was riotous behavior and assaults on police officers, and there was arson and looting, and there was general disorder, and it's a big political football, and people are on all sides of it, and they're defenders of it, and so forth and so on. But it occurred to me that I did not even know that the incident that happened with a white police officer and the black gentleman who died, who was killed, was a racial incident. I say I did not know that it was a racial incident. All I knew was that the police officer was white and that the man who was killed was black. It didn't follow from that it was a racial incident. We were making it into a racial incident. We being all of us here in the United States, we were making it into a reenactment of old American dramas of lynching and the murder of black people by Rowe police and so forth and so on. We took that thing and we said, yes, see, here we have proof of the knee on the neck of Black America. That's what Al Sharpton, the activist, said at the funeral of George Floyd. He said, America has its knee on our neck. And I thought, this great country of 330 million people with 40 million Black people. And here we are, 150 years after slavery and a half century since Martin Luther King was killed. Really? That's going to be the narrative for our country's politics for the next decade, for the next 15 years. This is what we're going to teach to our children. This is how we're going to arrange our media coverage of these events. That's a disaster for this country.
Okay, so how can you say that when you also have spoken so eloquently on topics such as the differential incarceration rate? This is not an assault on your statement, by the way. I'm very curious because obviously, you've spoken profoundly about the danger of that differential incarceration rate. And you can see that it's not that easy to conceptually disentangle, especially if you're politically motivated. But even if you're not, an event like that from that broader narrative that something's not right structurally, and perhaps this is a reflection of it. But, well, so I don't know how to reconcile those two viewpoints. I don't know how you reconcile them.
With difficulty, I suppose I could say, because they do point in slightly different, maybe even more than slightly different directions, but I'm trying to keep my perspective.
Right.
I do think that the advent of what they call mass incarceration, 2.25 million people under lock and key on a given day, half of them or 45% of them being Black people when we are 12% of the population, as a way of doing business going forward without any sense of urgency of reform, without any revisiting of our drug laws or our sentencing or whatever, without any attention to what is supposed to happen when someone is in prison, rehabilitation and whatnot, without any exploration of alternatives to incarceration as ways of responding to criminal offending, is bad for our country. I do believe that. And I believe the racial aspect of that echoes with our history in ways that are dangerous and that we dare not neglect. I'm the same guy. On the other hand, I think if you racialize the discussion of crime and punishment, there was the woman who was murdered at Columbia University a few years ago, and she was killed by these kids who were just trying to rob her, and they ended up stabbing her to death. She was white. She was, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name offhand, but she was a lovely young woman, and innocent is how she's going to appear in the photograph, and she certainly did nothing to deserve what befell her, and she was white.
Mm-hmm, right, so that's the other side of it. Yeah, right.
Tessa something is her last name, I can't recall. The kids who killed her were Black kids from around Harlem. They were in the park. Yeah, they were looking for a quick score. They had a knife. The woman is lying, she bleeds out. Now they've convicted. One of them has been convicted. And I'm looking at the photo in the newspaper, and here's this Black kid. He looks like a Black kid who's 16, 18 years old. He's a kid. And he's from this impoverished neighborhood, and he's Black. And the woman is white. I don't want that incident processed in terms of Black kid murders white woman in the park.
Yeah, okay. So maybe it's an issue. Maybe it's an issue of conflation, careless conflation of levels of analysis, eh? Because you're talking about a high resolution analysis of structural problems in the penal system, and to put that George Floyd event, to cram that into the same narrative, is sort of bespeaks of undifferentiated thought. And then you point out that the danger of that is, well, if you're going to racialize the white cop against the black victim of the homicide, Well, then why can't the same thing be done exactly the same way when the reverse happens? And maybe we shouldn't do any, or we should do as little of that as we possibly can. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take a look at these bigger structural issues, but we shouldn't cram it all together in one thing, because it's not.
That's very well put, Jordan. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. You said it better than I did.
Well, I listened to you, so that was a big help.
By the way, if we do cram it all into one thing, God help us, because there are people, and they're not going to speak out. There are people who will see it, process it, just as I hope they would not do. Black thug murders innocent white girl, and harbor a resentment and nurse that resentment. And that's a tinder box. That's a powder keg waiting to be lit. And we can dismiss it if we want to, but those people are not entirely wrong in their sentiment. They need to be disabused of that instinct, that instinct to conflate those levels of analysis.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the problem I have with ideology, is that's ideology is so low resolution. It does that conflation. It doesn't notice. And when you get educated, you start differentiating. It's like, and that's kind of what you said happened to you when you became more conservative. Once you got more educated, it's like, this is, when I take this apart and see all the moving pieces, this is way more complex than my low resolution representation guided me to believe to begin with. And that's, I've experienced that many times in my life when I tried to take problems apart so they could be solved instead of just discussed, let's say. You have to make a high resolution model before you can get anywhere. That's true in clinical practice, and I think it's true in public policy. And partly what we're doing when we're educating people, if we're doing it right, is saying, hey, you've got a map of the world, but it's not very detailed. And when you really look at it, well, here's the complexity. And that's what we're actually contending with. People don't like that because, well, it's complex, right? And you have the simple solution at hand to begin with. But the problem is it isn't the right tool for the job. You got to make it high resolution. And that takes a lot of work.
We're talking about George Floyd because there has recently been released a documentary film called The Fall of Minneapolis. It's up at Rumble for free. Anybody can look at it. We'll put the URL in the description of this post. It raises a million questions. It's very well done. They have original body cam footage that's been carefully curated and edited and whatnot. It gives you a sense. The arrest of George Floyd, the trial of Derek Chauvin, the aftermath for the police department.
Glenn, I want to interrupt very briefly. The body cam footage you haven't seen, folks. This isn't just the people standing there with their cell phones. This is crystal clear 2020 body cam footage. It looks like a movie of everything that happened in the whole 20 minutes before that makes all of it a very different story than what we've known. Anyway, go ahead, Glenn.
I just was going to mention that, ironically, Derek Chauvin was attacked in his prison, in a federal prison in Arizona, stabbed and injured seriously, a major medical threat
stabs
to his life. 22 stabs. I didn't know that. Just the other day, just within a couple of weeks of this film having been made public. And that's a coincidence that gives pause, that gives serious pause, because the film raises real questions about whether or not he got a fair trial in Minneapolis. It raises real questions about whether or not the narrative that comes out of the so-called murder, I said so-called, oh my God. How dare I even begin to think critically about whether or not it's appropriate to say what happened to George Floyd was murder. And yet you're moved, if you watch this film, I think, with an open head mind, you're moved to raise exactly that kind of question. So there we are.
Here we are. In 2020, we talked about how every one of these cases of a white cop killing a black man turns out to not be what we thought. So, it wasn't that George Zimmerman tapped Trayvon Martin on the shoulder.
Who, was not a cop. He was not a cop. He was a citizen, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's an important point. Didn't tap him on the shoulder and they had an argument and George Zimmerman shot him in the face. That's not what happened. George Zimmerman shot him with Trayvon Martin on top of him, seeming like he might be about to kill him, which is just different. Mike Brown did not die with his hands up. He was trying to grab the gun of Darren Wilson and was lunging at him over and over again. It's always like that. But I always thought that with the George Floyd case, you couldn't argue with the basic facts. It seemed that this white cop had his knee on this man's neck, which seems so barbaric, but that's what the photo that you always see looks like, and that he couldn't breathe because the knee was on his neck, and that he choked and died of asphyxiation. That seemed to be the fact, with various people connected to the Minneapolis police force saying that they were unfamiliar with this move, this business of putting the knee on the neck, that that's not part of their training. And so the issue was, why did that happen to George Floyd? Has something like that ever happened to a white person? In this case, it was Tony Timpa, who was killed in a very similar way, not, too long before George Floyd. But I always thought, yes, I've been happy to see Derek Chauvin going to jail. I have written about him as a murderer many, many times. And then look at this. Once again, we've been lied to. And the sad thing, Glenn, is that nobody, left of center is going to admit that any of this could be valid. Truth will not matter on this one.
I think that's a really important point, and I wish we'd come back to it. That is that the epistemic dilemma that we're in of being able to come to public agreement about what actually happened. And we're in a deep hole as a society because that's a tough one. But I wanted to just call to mind the scene in the documentary film that we're talking about, where the interviewer is with Derek Chauvin's mother, the mother of the cop, the cop, the murderous cop. He has a mother. He's locked away for some interminable period of time. He got, I can't even remember now, but I mean, it's hundreds of months.
Over 20 years.
Yeah. It's a long time. And the mother is saying, here's the training manual. The training manual showing a certain maximal restraint technique of immobilizing a recalcitrant suspect, which has a photograph in it of a man with his knee on the shoulder, not the neck, the shoulder, not in an asphyxiating, but in an immobilizing manner. Just as when you see the body cam footage of Derek Chauvin in that position, it's very, very, very similar. This was not allowed to be introduced into evidence at trial. The judge, who is depicted as having been biased against the cops in this documentary film, I don't know if that's true or false, but there is a point of view in the film. I think we have to acknowledge that. It's not wrong for being a point of view, but I think it's a point of view. I don't know the details about the judge who heard Derek Chauvin's case enough to be able to comment on whether or not he really is biased. I don't know that, but the film does raise these kind of questions. A police officer of commanding rank testifies at trial that that technique was not a part of the training, when trainers who spent decades training Minneapolis cops affirmed that, of course, it was a part of the training.
Is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department technique?
It is not.
When I heard that, I really wanted to get up off my chair and yell, bullshit.
So rather than a vicious, white, malicious, nigger-hating cop putting his knee on the neck of this poor, helpless man and strangling the life out of him, something different from that actually happened.
And if you look at the picture, you can think, if you're told that he put his knee on his neck, that it was the neck, but also the shoulder. And people, this is the important thing. This is so important. He's saying, I can't breathe. Okay. But there are three things. One, if he's saying it in that clear, strong voice, it would appear that he could breathe. Okay. So that was always a little strange. But maybe there's a point where you can say, I can't breathe, but you're getting dangerously little air. But still, that stands. Two, this is what's important. In the body cam footage, which we've never seen, George Floyd was saying, I can't breathe, when he was standing up straight and just being coaxed to get into the car. What they were trying to do was take him somewhere to get treatment because the drugs were severely addling his mind. And he wouldn't get in the car. And he starts saying, breathing air, standing up, I can't breathe, when nobody is anywhere near his neck or anything else. George Floyd was extremely high on fentanyl and meth to an extent that could have killed him sitting in a chair. If you're on fentanyl in particular, you get something called wooden chest, where you can't breathe if you've got that much in you. That's how high he was. Now, the issue is not the morality of him being high, but he was saying, I can't breathe, long before anybody had him on the ground. And then the third thing is this. What a lot of people are going to say is look at the agony of his face in the standard photo. It looks like he can't breathe. He's in agony. That grimace that we see is something that does move you. But if you look at the body cam footage we've never seen, George Floyd had that exact same look on his face when the cops just approached his car and said, get out. He was really messed up that night. I'm not moralizing. Just because I'm wearing a cardigan doesn't mean that I don't understand the joy of drugs and liquor, but he was majorly fucked up. And
it was during the day. It was not at night, but go ahead.
Yeah, I'm making it at night, but it's in daylight. And the cops come up and he's just, oh God, oh, don't shoot me. And nobody has a gun. I just lost my mother. His mother died years ago. Don't. They weren't threatening him at all. He was really, really messed up and he had that same look on his face. So I don't think, unless this is faked, here we are in the age of AI. I mean, we have to allow that just maybe. But unless that body cam footage is faked, Derek Chauvin didn't kill that man. I never thought I'd be saying that. But it appears to be true. Are we missing anything?
Do you remember Shelby Steele's film about Ferguson, Eli and Shelby, his son, Eli Steele, the filmmaker, and Shelby Steele, the writer? I think they called it What Killed Michael Brown. And in it, Steele introduces this concept. I think he calls it virtually true. It was, true in effect. A narrative that is so in coordination with a sentiment that's widely held in the public that people want to believe that it's true because it provides additional evidence to what they've been telling you all along is the case about this country and about the lives of Black people in this country, becomes unassailable. It becomes, in effect, true. It is, poetic. That was his phrase, a poetic truth. I just love that phrase. And this is back to this question of whether or not you can actually say that Chauvin didn't kill George Floyd, because, think what that entails. That means all that rioting, looting, and burning, all of that civil disorder that has had and will continue to have political ramifications echoing down across the years. What was that for? Or what about imprisoning those police officers? For crying out loud, Derek Chauvin is locked away for a lifetime. And the other cops also got jail time, too. One of them is Black.
That's another thing. The one who's Keung, and so you think he's Vietnamese or something? He's Black. Yeah.
Right. And a veteran police officer who worked in the academy training other police officers said that he was probably the best recruit that he had seen in a quarter century of service. Just as an aside, but they were and are being punished unjustly if indeed you conclude, as you have just done, that Floyd wasn't murdered out there. What about that? What about fueling a false narrative? What about giving further credence to a way of thinking about yourself within your country that is untrue to the reality of your condition? The cost here is inestimable.
Glenn, also, if you want to push it, if you think about what happened in the first half of 2020, also the whole racial reckoning and the grievous excesses that it's led to that make people write books like Woke Racism, et cetera. Frankly, we have to do it. We have to say it, and then we're going to move quickly on. The elevation of Ibram Kendi really was sparked in large part by George Floyd. He was known before that, but him being a phenom whose counsel is attended to by people cowering in their boots at becoming amoral people if they don't follow it, that happens in the wake of George Floyd. And it was a lie. It was a lie. I am still trying to grapple with the meaning of this. And so what it comes down to is George Floyd, he had serious heart disease. He wasn't an old man, but he had serious heart disease, untreated. He had serious atherosclerosis, untreated. He was very high on both fentanyl and meth, which is a lethal combination. Very high on them, probably taking more while he was in the car to hide it from the cops. He opens his mouth in the footage and you see he's got something on his tongue. It's not a chiclet. He's really, really high. He had COVID. He tested positively for COVID then. Had COVID. He smoked. He's a very sick man. And then all of this happens. He's frankly out of his mind because of all of this. He couldn't help it, but he was. And, you know, he was upset. He was agitated. And that, his heartbeat probably, you know, pumping harder. Now I'm going into a medical expertise I don't have, but he was very agitated at being detained by the cops. And remember, they had a reason for detaining him. He was trying to pass counterfeit money. They were detaining him. And it got worse and worse. He couldn't understand that he needed to just calm down, despite being told to by his friends. Just, you know, stop resisting, Floyd, one of his friends said. And so it got the best of him and his heart stopped. But it wasn't because he was asphyxiated. And the other thing is, there was no evidence in the autopsy report, which has not been shared with us until now. Not the autopsy report that was suggested by George Floyd's relatives, but the first one. There was no evidence of asphyxiation of any kind.
The police commander on the stand literally lied about the existence of the MRT and committed perjury. I mean, he would have committed perjury if he had said a false statement under oath. That's mind-boggling. That's what you guys are alleging, no?
Yes. To be clear, and not mince any words, we have that same person, the chief of police, Chief Medaria Arredondo, in an interview with an FBI special agent and a Minnesota BCA special agent, refer to the word hobble. They didn't introduce that into the conversation. It's a very peculiar word. Unless you're talking about how people walk, it's a pretty strange verb. And in this case, it's a noun. It's not an everyday conversation. It is written in this particular policy, Policy 5-316 of the Use of Force section of the Minnesota Police Department Policy and Procedure Manual, and it talks about the hobble. So clearly, he was aware of this. Now, back to a little bit about the lies of omission for a second to understand why I'm saying this constitutes perjury by lie of omission. You have to understand that there's a problem with that policy. It says if you use a hobble, you must put the person who is being restrained into what's called the side recovery position. An absolute utter failure of this policy is there is no Part B that says what to do if you do not use a hobble, but still administer the maximum restraint technique, MRT. I think very early on, someone realized we have a problem here. Clearly from the video, the officers are following that. It should seem very suspicious that the prosecution only uses one photo, Exhibit 17, a still frame photo, instead of the body cam video, to imprint, like making propaganda, imprint and isolate Derek Chauvin as if he is the lone officer with his knee on the neck of a person on the ground, when in fact, there are 3 officers, and arguably 4, since Officer Tao is trying to help find a hobble in the back of the car, that are working together in concert, exactly as written in policy, performing a maneuver together that one officer alone cannot perform. It is a 1 plus or 2 or more officer maneuver. So when on the stand, he's presented with this still image from Exhibit 17 and not the entire body cam video, we definitely have a lie or a construction or a manipulation happening that allows Chief Arredondo to say, well, prosecutors, if you're only asking me about this one moment, this one instance in this photo in Exhibit 17, I don't know what that is. And that's where we have this lie of omission occurring. And
you also have Inspector Katie Blackwell, who echoes that very thing on the stand as well, under oath.
What we train is using 1 arm or 2 arm to do a neck restraint.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is.
She has since been promoted to the assistant police chief position in Minneapolis, but also testifies that that's not a part of police training. But you can clearly hear in the film, these officers talk about how they've been trained in MRT, and this is several decades old at this point in their training manuals. In fact, I think we found MRT discussed as far back as 1993.
Okay, let's talk about Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison is the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota and was so at the time of Derek Chauvin's trial. And I recently heard from him after John and I's original discussion of your film was made public. And I want to share with you what he wrote with his permission and get your response to that. This is Attorney General Keith Ellison. Dr. Loury, I respect your political positions, though I do not share the ones I am aware of.
I like that.
However, your recent posting with Mr. McWhorter regarding the murder of George Floyd contained a factual assertion that Derek Chauvin, together with Alexander King and Thomas Lane, did not cause the death of George Floyd. This is false. While I don't have time to recount all the reasons why your assertion is wrong, I urge you to listen to the testimony of Dr. Tobin to see exactly why and how Chauvin, King, and Lane killed Floyd. I pray you take the time to learn exactly how George Floyd died. He was the victim of a homicide, which means death by another, according to all medical examiners who examined him. I make no other critiques of your political points, not that I agree, but I respect your right to your views. I'm writing you today to try to focus your attention on the factual question of who and what killed Floyd. The officers killed him as a matter of medical fact, Keith Ellison. And let me just mention that Dr. Martin Tobin is a medical expert on respiratory mechanics who testified, I did listen to his testimony, that Floyd died from a restriction of his access to air because of the positioning that he was being held in with the handcuffs against the ground and with the MRT.
So there was virtually very little opportunity for him to be able to get any air to move into the left side of his chest. So he was going to be totally dependent on what he'd be able to do with the right side.
It's an hour and a half of testimony. It's from this man who is clearly an expert. I doubt there's much bias. And if you're going to talk about the cinematic version of it, he's Irish. He didn't grow up with a dog in this fight. He's just basically doing his job. And from what he says, it was that Floyd was pushed against the ground and therefore had no ability to use his left lung. It was as if the left lung had been taken out. And he's trying to use his right lung, but he can't because King is pushing him down on his back. And also, Floyd is moving his shoulder in a way that apparently suggests that someone is trying to open up their chest cavity to get more air. And then after a while, he stops moving his shoulder. Now, no sign of asphyxiation. I said on in our last conversation to Glenn that, well, why is there no sign of asphyxiation? But apparently, Glenn, I don't know if I should have copied this. Ellison and I had a little exchange yesterday. And I said, well, why is there no sign of asphyxiation? And he said, there doesn't have to be. That's not always the way it works. A person can just not have been able to get enough air and they die anyway. Now, I genuinely want to know, given that Ellison is as sure of his facts as you two are of yours, what is the response? So, for example, let's say that you guys show that report where it says there are no signs of asphyxiation. I found that very compelling. Can we really say, and I'm asking this just because I want the truth in this, and audience, folks, if I turn out to be wrong about what I said last week, well, I'm not going to like it, but I'm going to face up to it because I'm looking for the truth. But I am going to resist a little because a lot of this still doesn't make any sense. Can you really say that shortness of breath didn't kill that man, especially because given all the stuff that was in him and how upset he was, that probably put him to the halfway point anyway? Can we really say that those officers did not cause him to go from sick and out of breath to dead? This is a genuine question.
Sure, if I may, let's get back to empirical evidence, first of all. And with respect to all the witness testimony, let's just grant them everything they said is actually factually accurate 100%. We still have a contention nonetheless. We have Dr. Andrew M. Baker, who is the pathologist, the only pathologist to actually examine George Floyd. So I would submit everything else thereafter is exactly that, conjecture. Unless you were actually materially involved in that autopsy, you're entitled to any opinion you'd like, however expert or however amateur it may be. Back to the autopsy report. It does not say the word homicide at all. And then we have a very, very peculiar situation with this report. And the case title reads something like Cardiopulmonary Arrest, Complicating Law Enforcement Subdual, Restraint, and Neck Compression. It does not say asphyxiation. Now, I know Ellison would like to say, well, it doesn't have to, because his attorneys actually argue this is just a style issue. The fact that Baker doesn't mention this is just a matter of style. That's a very interesting way of handling exculpatory evidence. But let's back up for a second. The first words in this report under the case title from the only pathologist who examined George Floyd says cardiopulmonary arrest. And interestingly, the first instance of Mr. Floyd complaining about shortness of breath is even before he was taken out of the police car, even before Derek Chauvin had touched him at all. We have George Floyd saying, I can't choke, I can't breathe, long before any officer is touching him, putting him on the ground, or kneeling on his neck, as we're led to believe here. And then interestingly, we learn that Dr. Baker was extremely concerned about the actual facts in his autopsy report not aligning with the popular narrative. And he expresses that to prosecutor Amy Sweezy the day of his conducting of this autopsy. That should be very, very telling.
I just want to be clear on what the rebuttal is of Dr. Martin Tobin's testimony here. What are you saying was wrong about what he said? Because as I listened to him, he had an account. No, he didn't do an autopsy, but it was about the mechanics. It was about the consequence of the body position, and as John described, the breathing and so on. And he says a lack of access to oxygen. You're saying that's theoretical? That didn't actually kill him? It could have perhaps theoretically have done so, but in the case at hand, it did not do so? Is that the claim? I just want to be clear.
Sure. I would say this. It's interesting, might be relevant, but again, it doesn't account for everything that happened. How would he explain George Floyd saying, he says, I can't choke, I can't breathe. Nobody's on top of him. Nobody's on his neck. In fact, for a few seconds, nobody's even touching him. No police officer is touching him. That testimony fails to account for that. Anything that's going to be expert, in my opinion, would need to do a much more vigorous, comprehensive job of starting at the initial part of the encounter and following it all the way through to the end to make anything that even reflects a comprehensive testimony. And then also one that precludes and excludes the idea of anything that looks like a lie of omission. When you don't talk about those facts in your testimony, I'm having difficulty understanding how you're not looking at the entirety of this encounter.
Oh, Lord.
Okay.
All right. One thing that I get from both the documentary and Tobin is that Chauvin and King didn't know they were killing him. If they were, they weren't trying to cut off his oxygen. They may have, but they had no idea that's what was going on. But I have something else. And this is a little linguist, but I think a lot of people have been thinking it, and you guys have actually given me some clarity. What was that expression about what criminals do, running game, is it called?
It's one of the street references. Yes, John.
This is something we have to remember. Tragically, ever since Eric Garner saying, I can't breathe, I suspect that saying I can't breathe could be used as a kind of running game. And so Floyd is sitting there. He knows he's being filmed. Maybe when he said, I can't breathe, it wasn't that the fentanyl was setting in, but he was using a line that he thought might scare the cops off a bit. Doesn't that sound really plausible, unfortunately?
Yeah,
and
it does.
We can't ever know. Glenn, what do you think?
Well, I think hands up, don't shoot. I think a hoodie with the Skittles and the iced tea. And I think I can't breathe became tropes. They became, sort of
They're
verbal tics that people would repair to in order to express something. And of course, it's plausible that could have influenced what George Floyd said on that occasion. That's speculation on your part, but it's plausible speculation.
When you put bracelets on people and they know they're going to jail, you will hear all sorts of things. There are, in fact, many tropes that you will hear. In fact, there were tons of videos after this effect where you have victims saying, they're trying to George Floyd me. They're trying to George Floyd me. This just goes on. It belongs to the sort of milieu, if you will, of repeat criminal offenders. They do have their own vocabulary. They do have their own mannerisms and behaviorisms. But there's a reason why the MRT as a technique used by law enforcement agencies all over the United States since decades ago, if there was a fundamental problem, if people were dying as a result of this over and over and over again, it would not be in the policy of so many police departments for so long.
Being heterodox, being against the grain, anti-woke, being the black guy who said the thing that black guys are not supposed to say, you can inhabit that persona to such an extent that your judgment is undermined by it. And I take that as a warning. I mean, I'll accept what you say. No, we didn't, do anything wrong. But I'm still a little bit chastened.
Well, Glenn, we need to talk about it's very important, the George Floyd issue, because our statements about George Floyd have stirred a lot of people to watch a certain documentary. And now there's been a response to the documentary. And we need to, what's the word smart people use? We need to contextualize Radley Balco's journalistic sleuthing in response to the documentary. What do you think?
Okay, let me try to set it up then. So the documentary is called The Fall of Minneapolis. J.C. Chaix and Liz Collins, Minneapolis conservative journalist filmmaking crew. Let's tell the police side of the story of what went down in the killing of George Floyd, including the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who had his knee on Floyd's neck. And it's an expose that alleges that Chauvin was convicted on flimsy evidence and through a biased court and process, and that he, in effect, is wrongly imprisoned in a federal prison in Arizona for the murder of George Floyd. Didn't kill George Floyd. You and I invited the filmmakers onto the show after we had discussed the film ourselves in a separate episode. That episode went viral. It got over 1.5 million views, and it drove a lot of traffic to the site where the film was being projected at YouTube. And then we had the filmmakers on, and we questioned them about some of the discrepancies. We indeed had heard from Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison about this film, about our depiction of the film.
Which
Ellison
led both of us to have some serious questions, too.
And we did some due diligence in looking into some of the things and shared with our audience what Ellison was saying, confronted the filmmakers with questions about it and so on. So we were involved in the discussion of the film and indeed put up posts with thumbnails like, "We were lied to," or words to that effect, John, because they were your words in that particular instance, that the narrative that came out of the killing of Floyd and the reality of what actually happened up there were not the same. Okay. Coleman Hughes also has picked up, the young Coleman Hughes podcaster, Coleman's Corner, Conversations with Coleman, took this up and put up a big piece at Barry Weiss's newsletter in which he took up the question of whether or not Derek Chauvin was rightly convicted of murder of George Floyd, decided in the negative and made the case based on the film, largely, that case was wrongly decided against Chauvin. And in reaction to Coleman, Radley Balco, now can I describe him properly? He's a veteran crime and policing reporter, was with the Washington Post for a long time. You want to add to that, John?
I don't know that much about him, but he's an established name. He's a respected figure. By no means some sort of marginal partisan, and he has begun a very detailed response to Coleman's piece, and by extension us. But he's taking Coleman's piece as the demonstration case for his purposes. And so far, there's been one very lengthy post responding to the documentary, and he's promising more. For some reason, in my head, it's 2 more pieces, but maybe it's more than that.
He is very hard on Coleman. He's got a snide, kind of dismissive tone. Coleman Hughes says he does his own research. Well, if he had done his own research, he would know the following. The following mainly being that the testimony of police leadership at the trial of Derek Chauvin to the effect that Chauvin was not deploying the standard technique of maximal restraint that the police officers of Minneapolis are trained to deploy. They testified that Chauvin was not in compliance with the maximum restraint technique. And the film alleges that was false, that testimony was false. The film, in effect, accuses these persons of perjury because in the manual for police training, there's a photograph of a situation in which someone is kneeling on the back or shoulder or neck of the person being arrested in a manner very similar to that which Derek Chauvin was deploying with George Floyd.
Many people have leaned on the shoulder, which maybe extends into the neck of people. Chauvin has apparently done that many times and did exactly what he did with Floyd. Many people have used it, but the idea is to only use it quickly, like for, say, 30 seconds, as preparation to getting somebody into this hobble, which is a completely different thing and keeps them from being a harm to themselves, because Floyd needed to be restrained. So you're supposed to do that in order to snap somebody into the hobble, not to just hold them there on the street for minutes and minutes and minutes at a time. That's what I took, especially from Balco. They did not say that in the documentary, and that is extremely misleading. And I would be interested to know what the documentary maker's response to that is.
But what I mainly got out of it is the filmmakers were dishonest in their depiction of the situation because they left the testimony of the police personnel who were mainly trying to say Chauvin was off the reservation. His behavior was not consistent with the appropriate procedure. It made it look as if they were saying something different from what they, in the fullness of their full testimony, was saying. And what I took from that was was 2 things. Discrediting the filmmakers was also indirectly discrediting people who took the filmmakers at face value, like me and you, and Coleman Hughes.
Glenn, I think on this that I think we were within our rights to call attention to the documentary. I think that it's one thing to look at all of this blow by blow. It's another thing to look at what a conversation is supposed to be. And national conversations are sometimes messy. For that documentary, as well made as it is, just in the objective sense, to be out there and for good thinking, bien pensant people to simply ignore it because it was made by conservatives would not be the way conversations go. Somebody needed to call attention to it. And frankly, we were some of the only people who would do it and be able to make big enough a noise to get other people to look. Now, this is the problem. It may turn out to be that this one was made by conservatives who were not well-meaning or who were incompetent or came in with some sort of seamy bias. That may be the case, but that's not true of all conservatives. And I think that we needed to bring it in. And then if Balco comes and basically refutes what they're saying, he has done a service and we can move on. But for that documentary to sit there, gradually seen by more and more people, with various people thinking, well, that's the way it really went, to simply not respond, I think is not constructive. I feel enlightened by Balco's work here. And if I could roll the tape back, I wouldn't have been so forceful in saying we were lied to. And frankly, I've looked at it. I do some hedges. I say, if this thing is true, et cetera. But still, the takeaway from it is me saying, here we go again. It's more Trayvon, et cetera. But, that's the way it goes. I left the window open, but we are not wrong to have called attention to that piece of work. What's necessary is to refute it. And that's what...
Well, no, the question isn't... I don't think the question is should the film have been acknowledged and recognized. I think the question is how it's interpreted. And I think the question for us is, were we too credulous? Not that we should not have ignored it, but that we should have been more skeptical about it, particularly about its technical claims, which challenge the limits of our own expertise in terms of being able to evaluate them. So we're trusting filmmakers to a certain degree when we do that. All right, you may want to reply to that. Let me just say another thing before you do. I've been asking myself the question, how could I have been so, I almost want to say gullible? How could I have been so credulous? How could I have not had my guard up? And I think the answer is, well, I wanted a counter narrative to the dominant narrative about what happened to George Floyd and the subsequent developments of the summer of 2020. I didn't like that police station being allowed to be burned to the ground. I thought that the lionization of Floyd, the elevation of him to a heroic status, to the point that the president, then a candidate of the United States, could say, I'm talking about Biden, in 2020, that Floyd's death resonated. I'm not quoting him, but this was the effect on a global scale. There were demonstrations all over the world, Black Lives Matter and all of that. Even more resonantly than did, even more profoundly than did the killing of Martin Luther King in 1968. I hope I don't misquote here, but I definitely believe that President Biden said, then candidate Biden said something to that effect. It was a big deal. It was a big fucking deal, the killing of George Floyd. The country seized up on something. When the opportunity to question the narrative came along, I jumped at it, and perhaps incautiously so. That's what I want to say, which raises a question in my mind more broadly. Being heterodox, being against the grain, anti-woke, being the black guy who said the thing that black guys are not supposed to say, you can inhabit that persona to such an extent that your judgment is undermined by it. And I take that as a warning. I mean, I'll accept what you say. No, we didn't, do anything wrong. But I'm still a little bit chastened by Radley Balco's, and what he does to Coleman. People can read this and see for themselves. Coleman, the youngish, upstart, conservative Black intellectual, is really disquieting. I mean, he says he's way out over his skis. He says, he's a propagandist in so many words. And Barry Weiss takes a hit indirectly from Balco. What kind of outfit is she running over there? Is she subject to the same temptations that we are as we inhabit this role of anti-wokeness, to too quickly embrace something that we ought to think twice about before we jump?
Glenn, you're harder on us than I would be, actually. Frankly, the narrative about cop killings has been lies so often that I think I wasn't motivated by sitting in a heterodox groove and beginning to play the role. With all due humility, I check myself for that as much as I can. However, you can't always be 100% sure. And given how strong the pattern is of the stories of that kind being lies, I think I was quite reasonable in thinking, oh, good Lord, here's another one of these cases. I wouldn't be surprised given the pattern. It isn't that I had some brief where I wanted to, disprove the story of George Floyd. It's that I thought, oh no, because frankly, I had believed it like everybody else, but I was thinking, oh no, is this going to be another one of these things where what we saw was not, what we were told we were seeing was not what was actually going on. And I think what's important is this, Glenn. When Ellison wrote us with his, polite scorn, here's what really happened. Both of us went and looked at the whole report of that pulmonologist. Both of us watched it. I certainly watched the whole thing. And it worried us so much that we called those two people on. That's when we called them on. We asked them questions. By the end of it, we were not saying, we were right. Or at least I certainly wasn't saying it or thinking it. There was kind of a big question mark by the end of it. We did our job. And Glenn, remember, there's a kind of person, kind of people who sometimes would even think of themselves as being in our camp. Think about it. Where they would have gotten the emails from Ellison with that tone of his. You can tell he hates us, but he's trying to do a service. And they would have dismissed it. They would have said, oh, fuck him. Forget it. They wouldn't have wanted to dig in and keep going. We both, frankly, I'm going to pat us on the back. We both had the presence of mind to think, even if this person hates us, we need to look into this more. We did our job. That's another thing that bothers me is that, frankly, it's not unreasonable to suppose that he's going to have a certain tribalist, hard leftist sense that all of that was okay. And if that's how you feel, quite frankly, you're going from the gut, not from the head. In which case, how dare you write to us calling us gentlemen? How would he feel if I wrote him instead of, A.G. Ellison or Mr. Ellison? Suppose I opened the email with sir, and then said some polite things. John McWhorter, sir. How dare he call us gentlemen? It's snide. How is he so superior? But that's another thing that bothers me, that I'm not sure what he's backing that up with. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if I could have heard the tone with which he said it, I might have more sympathy for your position. Being called a gentleman is not an insult in any way, shape, or form, but gentlemen, that kind of sneering, like he's condescending to call us gentlemen because he doesn't really believe we're gentlemen at all.
Yeah.
I take offense to that. And that seems to be the way you read that word on the page.
I did, because that's what he means. He means, all right, I'm going to hold my breath and deal with these two chuckleheads. No, I don't. It's not fair. I think that
I don't think he thinks we chuckle. This is interesting because my friend Rajiv said he talks about in his book with Dan O'Flaherty about stereotypes. Mm-hmm. He talks about stereotypes, right? So a stereotype is you have a generic read on somebody based on superficial information. You lump them in with everybody else who looks like that, and you say they're that kind of person. And a stereotype about a stereotype is being a person who might be subjected to stereotyping, anticipating that the person you're dealing with is stereotyping you, and then imputing to them motives that are perhaps inconsistent with their actual motives. That's your stereotype about their stereotype. And I think that's what you're doing.
If he wrote an email to Cornel West and Henry Louis Gates, he wouldn't open it with gentlemen. He'd have something else. Because notice that if he's writing to them, he likes them, I'm sure. It would be too cold. It would be too distant. It would be too formal. Notice he would only write gentlemen if it's you and me, or if it's Coleman and Thomas Chatterton Williams or something like that, or Clarence Thomas, where he would barely be able to manage the gentleman. But think about it. He wouldn't write it to people he liked. It's a smack. It's a what do people call it? It's a dig, I think.
Shane, I want you to close if any other windows that you might have open at this site.
Yes, gentlemen, my computer seemed to not be working. I'm kind of stuck.
Okay.
Having technical difficulties.
Folks, all right, folks, I've got to get this in right now. Yes, he just called us gentlemen. It's different. He's much younger than us, and we just met. He's using it in the default way. Ellison is, no offense, Shane, but Ellison is basically our age peer and our experience peer. The gentleman in that case is different, and it becomes condescending. Continue.
We're joined this week by Keith Ellison, who is the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, and who in that capacity oversaw the trial of police officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Keith has petitioned us to read his book and to come on the show and to talk about it because John and I have had several conversations here about the murder of George Floyd and the trial of Derek Chauvin. We, just to remind you, if you don't know out there in the audience, interviewed the filmmakers of the documentary film The Fall of Minneapolis, which is a passionate defense of the police in not only the killing of George Floyd, but also in the general conflict between police and community around police violence in the city of Minneapolis. They claim that Derek Chauvin was railroaded and wrongly convicted of the crime that Keith is proud to be able to say he oversaw the prosecution and successful conviction of. What do you want us to know about the trial of Derek Chauvin and the subsequent discussion of it that most concerns you?
Well, first, I want to say we can discuss anything you want, but to me, it is simply a false statement to say that Derek Chauvin and Thomas Lane and J. Alexander King and Tu Tao did not together kill George Floyd. It is a medical fact that happened. Derek Chauvin and all of them were amply represented by counsel. They had the full panoply of rights. They won many motions. They brought any expert they wanted to bring in. And we proved beyond a reasonable doubt to a fair and impartial jury that they were guilty of second-degree unintentional murder and third-degree murder, which was later dismissed through the appellate process, but also the murder two stuck. And so he's guilty of 2 crimes, and the 2 lower ones are subsumed within the most serious one. The other 3 pled guilty. Tutau didn't exactly plead guilty, but he waived his right to a trial and submitted all the documents to the judge, and the judge found him guilty, which is more or less saying, I'm guilty, but I don't want to say so out of my own mouth. They went to trial in federal court, found guilty there. Derek Chauvin was found guilty in federal court, and the other 3 went to trial and lost in federal court. And you guys may know that the jury pool in federal court is like all of southern Minnesota, which is much more rural than Hennepin County, which is where the Chauvin case was tried, much more white than Hennepin County. And in federal court, the judge does all the voir dire, meaning all the jury selection. So there's no way to really manipulate the jury. So what I'm saying is, you can say that the city should have been better prepared. Fine. You can say that there's a lot of good cops. I actually agree with you on that. But if anybody says that Derek Chauvin is not responsible for the murder and death of George Floyd, well, Derek Chauvin says otherwise. And if you look at all the evidence that we showed, clearly he is responsible. If you look at Dr. Tobin, the world-leading pulmonologist, Dr. Rich, cardiologist, several toxicologists, it is absolutely clear. Now, some people think, oh, well, he was killed because of the knee on the neck. That became just a shorthand for what happened. Really, it was not just the knee on the neck. It had to do with the compression of his chest cavity into the concrete. It had to do with his knee on the neck. And it had to do with the fact that his legs were held and he could not, your lungs have a bellow effect. Breathe in, breathe out. And you've got to get a certain amount of oxygen into your body. And if you can't, you're going to die. And it's going to take maybe no more than 5 minutes. Long after he didn't have a pulse, they did not do any medical intervention, even they were trained to do so. And, he was probably dead on the scene. So I just want you guys to know, did the mayor do all he could have done? I don't know. There's a whole lot of reasons to discuss and debate what happened. But what happened in terms of George Floyd being murdered by Derek Chauvin and Thomas Lane and J. Alexander King and Tutau, that is a non-starter. Anyone who says it didn't happen is deliberately uttering falsehoods for the purpose of disinforming the public. And I know that last thing is harsh, but I believe it to be true. Because if you can look on YouTube and see the trial. The trial was televised internationally. So, the only appellate issues that were really had any level of viability, they all failed, by the way, but the only ones that were even worth talking about was the jury exposed to too much pretrial publicity. And the court decided, well, look, everybody in the world knew about it. There's no jurisdiction you could go to. So you had to do it. You might as well do it in Minneapolis if you're going to do it anywhere. You can't legally move to another state. You've got to stay within the state of Minnesota. And you're not going to change people's level of awareness, but you may change their attitude about who and what George Floyd deserves. Right? You can change the jurisdiction. You can shop for attitudes, but you can't shop for impartiality because everybody saw it.
Keith, this is a genuine question. All of that is clearly, you can't deny any of it. Had Chauvin done that neck thing on lots of other people before?
Yeah, he did, but they didn't die.
Okay, and the other people didn't die. And so I think, therefore, we know that not only was it unintentional, but he would have been very surprised that it had that result. He was responsible, certainly, but he had done it before. This is the other thing I want to mention. I see all of this as a conversation that has played out where Glenn and I saw that documentary, and it turns out that the documentary was misleading in many ways. That seems quite clear, but it was also very well made. It was a brilliant argument. It was like Ciceronian oratory. They did a good job of what they were trying to do. So then we talk about,
isn't good propaganda always high quality?
Yeah, they did. And so then we talk about it, and you find out, and you bring us more evidence. Like you bring us the real deal. And both of us say, oh, wait a minute. Huh. And so then, you have this battle between Coleman Hughes and Radney Balco, et cetera. We've been learning truth. But frankly, in that very well-made documentary, especially when it turns out that Floyd said, I can't breathe, long before he was anywhere near the ground. That's a very complex moment. Like when somebody makes a play about this, I hope that they include that, because it looks like he was kind of using that as a line. It's become kind of a line since Eric Garner, but it could also be taken as that he was practically suffocating while standing up. I make no apology for having been distracted by that. And now you have given more truth, but there was nothing wrong with me and Glenn talking about it. That's my feeling. Anyway, go ahead.
And John, let me call you. I'm not on your show today to tell you how wrong you were and how bad you are. I'm here to say, you heard that side. Now hear this. And it's sort of adding to, and this is a testament to your fairness, quite honestly. As I was telling Glenn before you were getting on, you must know that I'm familiar with Liz Collins. I don't know the other gentleman. I don't know Mr. J.C. Chaix, but I do know Liz Collins because she's married to a fellow by the name of Bob Kroll, who's the former head of the Minneapolis Police Union. And let me tell you how I met her husband, Bob Kroll. When I was elected to Congress in 2006, he was talking to a group of police officers, only police officers in the room. And he says the people of Minneapolis are pretty dumb. They were at war with the terrorists, and they just elected one to Congress. A black woman by the name of Gwen Gunther raised her hand and said, are you saying that Congressman Ellison is a terrorist? And he goes on something about, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't say it that way, but he is one of them. And end up being that Chief Dolan has to apologize to me publicly. So what I'm trying to share with you is Liz Collins is clearly not just conservative, because, conservative could well be interpreted to mean you believe in the old tried and true ways. You believe in what your mama taught you, save your money, be honest, all that. And that's cool. And that's who raised me. My dad was conservative in that way. But Liz Collins is what I call a new conservative, really, really hostile and suspicious of anything black people are trying to do. I mean, they can't see police misconduct from what I can see. Can't imagine that there's such thing. And I just want to tell you, I know too many good cops to try to broad brush them all. But I also believe that we should have high standards for policing. And we should fire bad police. And we should criminally prosecute criminal police. And I don't think she believes that. I don't think she thinks any such thing as that exists. Her husband had about 27 excessive force complaints against him, some pretty bad. And yet she's totally comfortable with that, apparently. And so she makes this movie. And so my thought is so you guys may not know all that background, but I know it. And
I know it now. I did know it at the time. I know it in part thanks to Radley Balco's extensive coverage of this. I didn't know it at the time.
Let me tell you guys, it is true that we have rape, murder, and robbery going on in our streets and community. We have too many shootings. We do rely on members of law enforcement to help maintain safety. That includes prosecutors. I'm a prosecutor. But we also have people who don't live up to the standards of the job, who abuse their authority, who abuse it on a racialized basis sometimes, not all the time. We are aware of what happened to Tyree Nichols, right? And it's nothing wrong with saying that we should have high standards in policing, and that people who don't want to adhere to the standards of that badge should not be in the field.
Keith, just for the record, though, I get it. Why do you think the people in question are doing all this raping and looting and all this stuff? Is it white people's fault? This is a sidebar. Well, what do you think? Because
white people do most of the raping, looting, and robbing and shooting in our country.
No. So, in a black community, not just numerical. Why are they doing that?
I think there's a few elements. One is, and it does go back to the universal, John, for me. I mean, why did Bernie Madoff rip off billions of dollars from thousands of people? Because he wanted to. It's the malevolence of the evil of the wicked heart at some point. At some point, that is the explanation for Black crime, white crime, Asian crime, any crime, right? But I would say that when it comes to the Black community, to me, I can't get through 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of disparity. Don't tell me these events are not related to each other. Sometimes what you have in the Black community is over-policing. So, for example, there are whole states where no white person was ever charged with crack. None. So now we want to say, the Black folks are into crack. Whoa. The CDC says that everybody uses dope, but you only look for drug addicts in this neighborhood. Now that is a driver. Let me also say that Black people are overwhelmingly represented in the exonerated, John. What does that mean? That means there's a lot of Black people convicted of crimes that they didn't commit. Think of the Central Park Five. Now, none of this am I saying, now, John, hear me? Hold on. I'm not saying Black people don't commit crime. I'm saying Black people commit crime for the same reason everybody else commit crime. But I'm also saying, given our nation's racial history and past, that we are also unfairly targeted for law enforcement, particularly in the war on drugs. If you go back to, just use rape for a minute. How many Black men between 1865 and 1925 actually raped some white woman?
Oh,
they didn't.
One, I don't know.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that part of why you have Black criminality is just some people are just, they don't care about others and they only care about themselves.
Keith, very quickly. What I fail to understand, and I really mean it's something that always perplexes me. I hear everything you're saying. You are more moved in your gut by Liz Collin and Derek Chauvin and the kind of discrimination that you're talking about. That moves you more than the fact, and I'm sure you're aware of this fact. Yes, there are evil people everywhere, but in the typical American city where there's a significant number of Black people, Black men commit a vastly disproportionate number of homicides. Vastly disproportionate, mostly upon each other, but that doesn't exonerate it. The issue is not white people kill white people and Black people kill Black people. Why do Black people kill so many Black people? It seems to me that doesn't bother you very much. I'm politely asking you why.
No, let me just say this. I think that you're incorrect about that. There's a difference between law enforcement committing murder and private citizens committing murder. What's the difference? One has the imprimatur of the state, and the other is a criminal who let me remind you, bro.
I've never understood this argument. I don't get it. Maybe I lack legal training or something. And it's always imprimatur.
You don't need legal training. You don't need legal training. Take a line from Ghostbusters. If a private citizen commits a crime, who are you going to call? The police. What if the police commit a crime? Now you're calling on the agents of the state who have a responsibility and obligations under the Fourth Amendment, right? And so it is, to me, more negatively impactful for democracy.
Miss Jackson doesn't care about that when her son gets killed. I don't get it.
You're asking a good question, but that's not the question. You're asking me, why is it that one kind of recurrent killing gets attention and another doesn't get nearly as much? But here's the thing, John, you don't live in Minneapolis, so what you don't know is that I prosecute murderers all the time, man. Every day and all the time.
Your heart doesn't seem to bleed.
Why does it need to? Well, how do you know, though, John? I mean, here's the problem.
Well, tell us then, because John is talking about affect. He's talking about passion.
No.
He's talking about leadership. And when we're facing such violence in our own community committed by our own people, we look to someone like you, an African-American elected official, to frame that issue in a way that puts some responsibility on the community to address what's going on among ourselves, regardless of whether or not it's caused in some long historical story by slavery and Jim Crow and whatnot. And how do you react to that?
Well, I'll be happy to react to it. But if you ask me why people dying at the hands of law enforcement have an obligation to safeguard those same people, and why I have another kind of emotional reaction when a private citizen commits a crime against another private citizen, the answer is one has a systemic problem with solving, and the other does not have a systemic problem with solving. You know what? There was recently, if you guys got any kind of ability to search anything right now, search the name Zaria McKeever. You can look it up right now if you're able. What you'll find is that a man who was an adult organized 2 teenagers to go into the home of his ex-girlfriend and father of his child. And he organized them, supplied them with guns, brought them, gave them a ride, gave them material clothing so they could obscure their identity. And they broke into her house and they were looking for the boyfriend to harm. He ran out the back. She tried to calm the 2 guys down because they knew the 2 shooters were after the boyfriend. And they shot her 6 times and murdered her. Now, the local prosecutor was going to say, because juveniles don't have enough brain development, we're going to treat them within the juvenile system. I listened to the victim. I listened to the family. I listened to the black churches. And I went to the governor and I said, Governor, you have the authority to hand me this case. Hand me this case. And I took that case and we're prosecuting those people right now. Now, you guys don't know about that case because you're not from Minnesota. But listening to what happened to that family and that young woman, that wonderful young woman, is moving me forward from an emotional point of view. I took that case, got myself in trouble with a bunch of other prosecutors because they don't like the AG taking their cases. And I don't plan on taking their cases. But that case, I could not abide. I mean, look, if that case would have went down, if that kid would have got 18 to 24 months of juvenile, he would have been in the line at Target with that girl's father in a short period of time. He represents a terror to the community, to the family. I took that case, I prosecuted.
I want to ask you about policing again.
Let's go.
Because one of the things that really did strike me about that documentary, The Fall of Minneapolis, was their accounting of the burning to the ground of the 3rd Precinct headquarters and of the demoralization that had on the cops. And of course, Keith, I agree with you. Bad cops need to be held accountable. Full stop. Nothing else to say about that. They're subject to the law just like anybody else. And, more power to you for enforcing the law against bad cops when the law so requires. But the morale of the police department is not an insignificant thing. And letting that police station be burnt to the ground was a horrible thing for me to witness. I just wonder how you feel about it.
Yeah, that was extremely unfortunate. And it was horrible, quite honestly. And it definitely shook a lot of people in Minneapolis to see that.
These people keep telling me it wasn't burnt to the ground. What are the facts on that? I really don't know.
It was burnt to the point where no human being could survive if you were inside of it at the burning. It was burnt to the point. Yeah. We'll put it like this. Are there some bricks standing on top of other bricks? Yes.
But it was burned to the ground.
Yeah, okay. It was burned beyond any and all functionality. You can't rebuild it. It wasn't like there was a fire in 1 or 2 rooms.
Okay.
They burned it down. But I will say this. The people who did it were prosecuted and are serving sentences now, and that is extremely important. And I don't think any of them were black. Maybe one of them was, but several of them were not. And some of them were not even from Minnesota.
It's always like that.
This situation attracted extremely negative people who wanted to foment pain, suffering, and crazy and chaos. And I think they wanted to do it for a lot of reasons, but one of them was the peaceful protest of what happened to George Floyd, in my view, was righteous. How do you tarnish the peaceful, First Amendment protected raising of voices, say this abuse of government power is wrong? Well, you infiltrate the group and you do things that the group will be held responsible for.
You're saying pro-police elements infiltrated the anti-police mob?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Because I don't think the Boogaloo Boys are pro-police. I think they're pro-chaos.
Okay.
You follow? So let's be clear. No way I'm saying that these people were in favor of the police. What they're in favor of is fomenting a chaotic, crazy situation.
Okay, so they're anarchists.
You know what? I know anarchists who would never do anything violent like that. But yeah, I would say that they are people who want disorder. And let me just tell you this whole defund the police thing, which I was never for.
I was going to get to that.
Well, let me just jump the gun. Let me tell you, Mike Johnson, you know who he is? He's a speaker.
Yeah, he's the mayor of Dallas.
He's a speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States.
Oh, that guy. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Other Mike Johnson.
Right.
He wants to cut the ATF, the FBI, and the DOJ. Is he defund the police? I think he is. Let me tell you, defund the police was an unfortunate term used by some. Hear me out now, Glenn, before I lose you. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, there was some very angry young people who I believe had a reason to be upset. And they used some, what I think, irresponsible language, which then got weaponized into some national rhetoric. I don't know one Democratic politician who ran on the banner of defund the police. Why? Because it's stupid, right? Now, I will say that we should pay care to the budget of the Department of Recreation, Education, school lunches, after school programs. If we cut all those programs and send the money to the police department, we're not doing the upstream preventative work that we could be doing. So there is a budget conversation to be had about what's the proper allocation, right? But defund the police was dumb, is dumb, and mostly it was blown out of proportion by the right wing. I was in Wisconsin. They were accusing Mandela Barnes of defund the police. I'm like, what? So it got politicized to a very high degree.